Good afternoon and welcome to another creative episode. Thank you all for joining me. In today's episode, I wanted to talk about how to use a palette knife. So everything to do with palette knife technique and how to create a painting. Firstly, I wanted to thank the wonderful people that have commented on a couple of my palette knife videos that I've demonstrated and that have basically requested to say, can you please put together, it would be nice to see a video in detail of how you use a palette knife. So I will do my best to impart all the information that I have learnt over the years, which have definitely helped me, and hopefully you can find a nugget that it will help you as well. Okay, so here we go. Now I've written a couple of points because I didn't want to miss out on any information to impart here today. So bear with me, we'll go through everything, and I'll certainly also put through a demonstration of an artwork and the technique and how to actually use a palette knife. First of all, how I got started using a palette knife is really by a sheer coincidence or synchronicity. I attended an art class probably about 20 or so years ago, and the teacher was incredibly observant and astute, and he noticed that when I paint, it was incredibly direct. So the first point that I'll make in terms of how to use a palette knife is technique is paramount, meaning what kind of an artist are you? What do you like painting like? Are you quite vigorous and energetic and move about, or do you like to take your time? Do you like to make slow and gentle strokes? This is really important because once you understand what type of an artist you are, using the palette knife becomes incredibly easy. So discovering your technique is probably key in this scenario. With this particular tutor, he noticed that I was very direct. I mean, I really wanted just to put paint on, paint wet into wet technique. And when he saw that, he came over and he said, listen, how about you switch over to a palette knife? I didn't have one with me, so he gave me one of his. He walked me through how the knives work and how each one would be applied within an artwork or when you're mixing color on your board. I mean, to be quite honest, that really opened up for me an incredible doorway to how I then, slowly began to develop my own personal style. And this was purely because I was frustrated with the brushes. The brushes, I seemed to take more paint off my canvas than what I was putting it on. I was also finding it incredibly stressful and difficult to have pure color. So when I put color on an artwork, it seemed to get muddled. Versus when I was working with the palette knife, I could literally achieve that crisp, moving edge. So technique, paramount. What I also wanted to stipulate in this as well is that you need to then be comfortable with your own personality. And I know this is going to sound maybe a little bit frou-frou. What do you mean, personality? There are as many different techniques as there are different artists. And what I mean by that is we all have our own individual energy within us. Now, I love immediacy, and for me, that immediate slap of paint instantly translates into energy. And particularly when I paint, whether a portrait, whether a still life or a landscape, when I feel the energy of my surroundings, I'm able to impart that feeling really easily on the canvas board. I started initially painting or learning how to paint realism. So really those detailed paintings that you see all around social media, that they look like basically photographs. And what I learned through that process is that I understood technique a lot better. And with me in particular, I started learning to paint the Flemish technique. And I'll enclose an old painting that I did decades ago, and that means that you're required to do a red undertone, then a grey undertone before you apply colour, which is how you can achieve your realism in artworks. So remember, finding out how you like to paint will really, it is the key and will give you that open doorway, open capabilities to then be able to use the tools that you want. But in this case, if you really want to understand the palette knife, understand that that is a tool that requires energy and movement. You can't necessarily dab with a knife because you can tell that the painting has been overworked. So remember, find out the personality that you are like, and then that will give you the open foundation, the capabilities to be able to then incorporate the palette knife. Point number 3 is be mindful still as you're painting. Whether you're using a palette knife or not, you still need to keep in mind your values, form, edges, background, middle ground and foreground. These technical art techniques need to be adhered to no matter what you use, palette knife or a brush. But in the case of the palette knife, it can get out of hand pretty quickly if you don't pay attention to your values, to your tones, to your edges and your form, because the knife is really a larger surface area, so it doesn't have the capabilities to be that delicate as what you'd have with a brush. And so you have to stay on top of, is the edge too sharp? Is the a value really off in terms of what I want to achieve with the subject that I'm painting? Most people tend to feel that the palette knife gives them this power, and so then I'm going to just use it and just see what happens. And that's great, there's no wrong here. Rather to say that if you want to still achieve texture and retain your composition, you must adhere to values, edges, form, and your color tone within your artwork. The fourth point here to consider when you're using a palette knife is understanding color. I'm still very mindful when I paint, again, whether a portrait or a landscape still life, is whether or not I've got warm tone, cool tone, middle tone, highlight. You have to always understand all those color tones, because every one of those different colors that you apply within your work, in particular landscapes, is able to give you the depth within your composition. So these are the small points to keep on top of as you're using a palette knife. Certainly, you have to practice, you have to go through art classes that teach in a palette knife in order to build those synaptic passages in your brain if you've never used a palette knife. Otherwise, take some of these points that I've mentioned and now begin to adapt them to your personality and see where or not you need to, add a little bit more, take away a little bit more, and begin the practice of how to use a palette knife. Okay, so let's go through the type of palette knives that I use and the ones that are in my studio. So currently I have about 6 different palette knives. 2 are doubles, by the way, but 6 different knives that I use. And I'll hold up the one that I mostly use, and you'll see it's this one up here. Now what you'll notice is the edge on one of the sides of this palette knife is, is quite round or dented, and that's because of the amount of time that I've used it. It's literally being used numerous times. Every single time I paint, I change the shape of this palette knife. Now, why do I like it? I love this particular one because its center of I don't know how to describe it. When I paint with it, its center is at this point up here. I don't know if you can see that. So literally it's at this point up here. So when I press on that, get the camera off my face. So when I press on that, its middle point is in this particular section. That means I'm able to move with the tip, not necessarily the bottom part. So that part up here is quite stiff. So the tip of this particular, let's move it this way, this particular knife, working with cameras is a chore, I tell you. This particular knife is quite easy to maneuver and move about. Now, I will talk a lot more about technique, but this is one of my most favorite knives. These ones here, as you can see, this particular one is quite long and flexible. Now, its center of movement is more towards the middle here, and when I use this particular knife, and you can see that's quite flexible as well, it tends to move paint just from these two middle areas. And again, with this one here, I would probably use on a larger surface. These two, which are exactly the same, they're not they're the same size. They are like my favorite one, but they're a lot wider and stubbier and not as flexible. So these I tend to use to mix color on my color board or my palette board, whereas the other ones I use to actually work on the painting behind me. So last one is the scraper. Really, I don't, unless I've got a particular straight edge that I want to work across, and I'll do something like that, real geometrical shapes, it doesn't really feature that much in some of my works. What palette knives you want to use, it really is up to you. It again comes back to your preference in how you like to work. I choose to use, my favorite one being this one, I choose to use this one because it tends to feel more as part of my overall extension of my arm. So when I use it, I don't make movement, or the motion for the palette knife isn't here in the wrist, it's more of a shoulder action, shoulder movement. So because of that and its flexibility, then it feels like I'm literally painting with my extension of my arm versus a rigid metal structure. The motion of your palette knife is also important. How you use your palette knife is incredibly important. Now, because you're working with thicker paint, you can get quite used to moving paint the same direction on your canvas. This can be a little bit monotonous, because when and if you do tend to just move paint in that same direction, what tends to happen is when you hang that painting in a gallery or in your home, the light will only catch certain thicknesses within that paint and make the painting look like it's got a shadow. Unless you then light up that painting directly from the front, it will have some weird shadows in there. So be mindful that when you move paint, you place paint, just like a brush, you need to move it in all different directions in order, again, to give it movement and energy and flow, but also keeping in mind your soft edges and hard edges. Okay, so the first point that I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but always mix your color on your color board. Now, I've put this paper here simply so that I'm able to get the correct filming and not have any reflection. You'll all use your color board that you see fit. For me personally, I have a glass board that you see is under here, and that's the glass board with the dark cover underneath, and that's purely again for me to be able to see the tones a lot better. So be mindful, if you're mixing color on a white board, it can be really difficult and challenging to get the right colors mixed, the right values. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to use this paper for the sake of demonstrating. I'll show you that again, when we mix color, let's take blue in this case, French ultramarine blue, and a little bit of white. Notice that how I move my palette knife is from side to side, but it almost has a figure 8 motion to it, not a straight, side to side motion like that. If you were to paint with your palette knife in I'll show you, side to side, you'll tend to scrape more, and it will end up on the top. I don't know if you can see that on the top of your palette knife. So there's a figure 8 that happens when you move your palette knife when you begin to paint, and that's what you want to concentrate on. You're moving it from side to side to side. And what happens, just to leave all that paint there, when you then paint wet into wet, let's say in this case I want to add more white, I'll first mix that on my board, pretend this is my board, and I'll add maybe a little bit of permanent crimson to that, create a nice mauve, deep mauve color. I'll take some of that and I'll incorporate it, but move it in a figure 8 situation. So I don't scrape anything off, rather I'm incorporating it on top of the actual color that's already applied beforehand. Here's an example of applying the highlight on your painting. So in this case, I'm using a yellow ochre, or I've made my own yellow ochre, and you'll notice I'm lightly placing it on already existing color. And again, take note, the painting here is fairly wet, it's not dry, so it is making it easier to apply the color or to create the soft edges. The challenge really when working wet into wet is not to scrape off anything underneath as you're adding more layers on top. So you need to just be mindful. Again, like I mentioned before, it's like icing a cake, always placing it on top fairly lightly, and then again focusing on your soft edges, hard edges, and your values as you continue to create more depth and movement and energy with your palette knife. Here's another example of working with a palette knife, and in particularly focusing on soft edges, hard edges, shapes, color, value, and tone. It's a little bit more challenging when you're painting portraits because you need to maintain the character of an individual. Otherwise, that process can be lost fairly quickly. And character is defined in terms of how I interpret painting a portrait. For me, is looking at the shapes within the person's face. So you have to maintain that as you paint. But as you notice, every time I'm adding a new color, I'm making sure that I'm blending into the previous tone. And this is a really important process. Otherwise, it makes the face look quite jagged and hard, and there's not that softness about it, which is again another reason that I love painting wet into wet. Now this is this landscape that I did the other day, and I will enclose the speed up version of how I came to this point. But it's dried at this point, so it's no longer wet into wet, and that means now when I do the highlights on top of that, I have to be very mindful in how I incorporate my highlights, because again, you have to pay attention to your hard edges and soft edges. If I simply just take the color and wipe it across, then it kind of, I don't know if you can see that, but it hasn't got a place. I mean, it just looks like it's placed on top. Let me zoom out, and hopefully you get that idea of what that looks like. So if I just zoom out of that, it's pretty much a blob of orange there, so it doesn't actually make sense to the rest of the painting. So what you want to do when you begin to add your highlights, in particular with a palette knife, now you want to gently incorporate and again, utilize that technical ability of art, which is soft edges, hard edges. But again, remember, it's a figure 8. It's not a big hard movement. You're almost holding your palette knife so gently. It really is like icing a cake, and you're putting the final icing layer. And see, as I've moved that, now I've worked that tone into the grass, or into the landscape of this particular composition. Again, I'll take more of that color that I've mixed, And I'll just move the camera a little bit further in, bear with me. And I'll add another bold, just as if I'm putting something on top. So see how, again, that doesn't quite make sense just to sit there. So if I then take again the palette knife and gently work the edges and create the smooth, soft edges, but still maintain the color tone, now it's becoming part of that landscape. Again, just to reiterate, keep in mind, I'm not moving it back and to and fro, left, right. It's more of a figure 8 movement. So you're always lifting one end and pushing with the other, lifting one end and pushing with the other. So back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Okay, so here's what that looks like again from a bit more of a further distance away. Again, I've taken my color and now I'm going to just simply add that to the painting. And you can see that it is quite bold, quite vibrant. I could leave it there, but to me that just looks out of place, and I want to be able to mix it in with the landscape and make it part of that landscape. So again, I'll take the palette knife and I move gently on top of the edges and create a soft edge. And what you'll see that now I'm blending even this orange, which is a little bit darker, in the top section of the highlights that I've already added, and incorporating that. The beauty of now painting wet on dry is you're creating what's known as a scrambling effect. So whatever's left on your palette knife, you tend to drag across, it will go over the other paint there as well. So it almost looks like it's a translucent tone. But see how now by blending this new color tone, new value, the orange that's within the painting, we're now building the movement of the viewer's eye by focusing on that orange and then taking you through the actual. Here's a simple demonstration on how the palette knife can be utilized and how it works. I'm starting off with a very, very quick underpainting and putting in my values using a brush. Now, as you can see at the bottom, there's a half semicircle, the brim of the hat, and on both left and right hand of the hat are 2 rectangles with triangle at the top. So this is what I mean when I'm referring to painting in the shapes and knowing and seeing the shapes within your subject matter. So I'm starting off really basic underpainting with this hat and putting in a mid-tone value of the hat. I haven't started with the dark, and that's purely because I wanted to later mix it and create my soft edges and incorporate it within the actual brim and other aspects of the hat. So now I've started to put a bit more of a darker tonal value here. Again, notice how my palette knife moves in that figure 8 motion. There's the back and forth within the paint, again mixing it as I go through. The light source for this subject matter is from the left hand side, so that's the reason for the lighter value on the left hand side of the brim, as well as the lighter value of the rectangle on the left hand side. So I'm also adding some grey tones and grey values within the hat, and I generally tend to do that simply to add interest and more depth and excitement within the composition. So this is again a little bit more knowledge about understanding colour and tonal values. I won't go into depth in this particular example, but that's the reason for the grey color addition in here. So now I'm building it up and slowly adding my lighter tonal values, and you can see that I've started to mix the grey within that lighter aspect. And now I'm going to that top segment and I'm adding the reflection of the sun within the left hand side of the rectangle, and you can see the hat starting to take shape. There's a little bit of depth and movement. It feels like it's, there's a front part, middle part and a back section of the hat. Notice as I've just added this lighter tone, right at the forefront of the brim of the hat, the edges are very, very strong. It's not soft, and I want to keep it like that, purely because if I was to put a face underneath that, then that hat would denote a sharp edge between a soft face and the object of the hat itself. So now I'm adding the accent of the hat, and sometimes that can be a piece of cloth or leather that some hats have. And again, I've chosen to go darker just so that I can show the difference between the top part and the bottom part of that hat. The movement here again, keep in mind, is to keep your edges incredibly soft. So the benefit of working that wetting to wet process, I get to mix every single tone as I go along. And as I start to add the darker value from the right hand side, again simply because the sunlight is coming from the left hand side, you can see that object starting to achieve its 3D shape. You can see all the nuances within it and it's starting to get interest. Now notice here as I'm working the palette knife and moving the paint to get the soft edges, I'm really focusing, and that was a mistake by the way, if you just noticed, I'm going to go back and correct it. I'm really focusing on making sure that there is different movements in different directions, softness of edges, and I like sometimes how paint tends to mix that perhaps wasn't supposed to mix, but it's a basically mistake. I tend to leave those in. I think they're quite good. At this point, I'm adding some point of interest and accents to the hat. Perhaps this person might wear flowers within its hat. But notice, I would say that here is probably the only time that I would say that I dab. It's not really dabbing, but just placing the color notes. Notice where I make the mistake and how easy it is to correct when you are using a palette knife. There he goes. I've just made that mistake up and pulling it down. So working with a palette knife really is all about going back and forth, pushing and pulling paint around. Again, keeping in mind your values, your form, your shape, soft edges, hard edges, background, foreground. Because even in using or painting something as simple as a hat, you still need to continually assess whether or not am I in the right value. Am I creating the right form for this particular shape? Meaning, have I given it depth? Does it look like a hat? The knife really acts as an extension of what's going on in your mind. Too many times, and I've seen this with a lot of my beautiful students, too many times when they use a knife, they are concerned that they're making the incorrect stroke and that they've made a mistake. Now, there's nothing wrong with making a mistake. I encourage it because you learn from that. Rather to say that when you have clarity in your mind and when you have a clear perspective of what you want to achieve, the painting really doesn't start on here. Or when you paint something, and I'm getting a little bit, metaphysical, I don't know what word to use. So having that clarity is important. And each time I mix a tone, each time I create a value, I always refer it back to the object that I'm painting. Is it too light? Is it too dark? Is it in the cool or the warm family? Have I distorted the form of the object? Because sometimes the palette knife, and you've seen when I added the flowers, sometimes you can go too much and you think, oh, that I didn't really want that. So that's what I'm saying. Don't be afraid of mistakes, embrace them, rather have clarity in what you want to achieve and then begin to place down your paint. Start in here and it gets completed on the board. So again, here's an example of how to move your palette knife. So if we're taking this particular color here, and I'll just add the light blue so that you can see it on camera, the movement of your knife is up and across. And notice how it's not straight up and down that way, rather it's lifting and dragging, lifting and dragging, lifting and dragging. So notice how that moves that way, that way, that way, lift and drag. And that's how you, I mean, in this case here, really, I'm pressing quite hard so I can show you the movement, but it's nowhere near as firm as when I, paint something or put paint onto the canvas. So it's dragging it and lifting and dragging, lifting. It's that figure 8 motion that takes place. And notice how, if I move back this way, see the palette knife is lifted up, or it's angled up at, I don't know, 30 degrees, 15 degrees. So it's that figure 8 motion. And again, remember, if you've ever used icing, if you've baked, it's simply as simple as icing a cake, because even when you ice a cake, you can't dig and punch the icing, otherwise you'll see all your marks. So it's the same thing with this palette knife here. It's moving it in that figure 8 motion. Movement of figure 8, lift and drag back and forth, which is really the technique for how to utilize a palette knife. A lot of people tend to push it that way and just work with this middle part of the knife. I don't really like that. I like to be able to utilize the most flexible point of it all. And thank you all for joining me, and thank you for your support and for watching all my videos. I truly appreciate it. I hope you've been able to get a small insight into how I utilize my palette knives and how they work. This is truly a topic of conversation and a demonstration that is so much more worth it if you were to go to an art class that does palette knives. Certainly, I know a lot of my students received an incredible amount of experience when they came to classes. But in these 15-20 minutes of this video, I hope that you're able to gather some nuggets and be able to then incorporate them in your daily art practices. I really do appreciate that you are tuning into my videos, and I want to encourage everybody to pick up a brush, a palette knife, and expand and release your creativity. It's incredibly important. When you do that, you access a part of yourself that is far greater in its expansiveness than what I could ever express. I thank you all. I want you to remember that while you are in the world, you truly are the light of the world. Ignite your creativity and continue expanding and amplifying your art practice. Until next time, thank you guys. Bye.